Jasmine Cresswell, welcome to the Rocky Mountain Writer Podcast.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
We are excited to catch up with you and reflect a little bit because we are celebrating the 40th anniversary of Rocky Mountain Fiction Writers this year, and your roots and connections go back to the very dawn of Rocky Mountain Fiction Writers. So, yeah.
I've reached the stage of my life where I feel that my roots go back practically to the dawn of time sometime. But anyway, yes.
Yeah. Well, we're following up on an article you wrote, and hopefully lots of people are going to read it, but it's also fun to just sort of walk through and chat about some of those memories and experiences. But before we get to some of those earlier times and what led you to Denver and to Rocky Mountain Fiction Writers, why don't you just set the scene for us now? I mean, you have had quite a career as a writer. And so for folks who don't know you, is it 70 million, some incredible number of books in print?
I don't know how many books in print. I have written 70 books. If you count the worldwide sales.
I do.
It's only about 20 million was the last figure I ever remember hearing from my publishers. But still, it's nice to know that there are 20 million copies of your work floating around out there.
Yeah.
It's gratifying. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And give us an idea what genre those are in.
My earliest books were all just what I consider to be straightforward romances. Although the very first manuscript that I ever sent to Harlequin was rejected because it had, quote, too much suspense and that they only published straight romance. I had no idea that it had excessive suspense in it. I was not attempting to do that.
Yeah.
I also, because my original intention had been to have a career at the college level as a history professor, it was just interesting and challenging to write historical novels, which I love to do. I think perhaps in terms of sheer enjoyment that came from the writing, my historical novels probably gave me the greatest. But what I ended up really doing with the sort of single title publishing career was romantic suspense, where there was really a lot of emphasis on the suspense.
Yeah.
So that's basically my background.
Yeah. Did you, as a young child, was the fiction storytelling bug there, or when did that sort of come along?
Absolutely. I was an only child, and Christmas was the best possible time of year because all my relatives knew to send me books. And so Christmas afternoon, I would choose the very most exciting and start reading. And libraries in England were very developed. And Saturday morning, my father and I would go together to the library where we would collect armfuls of books. And at some stage, my mother just abandoned her self-appointed task of scrutinizing everything I was reading to make sure it was suitable. And so I moved out of the children's department and into the adult department, and life started to look very good. So reading was very important. I don't think it ever occurred to me that I could do something as clever as writing a fiction, a novel. But, you know, when you're in college, at the graduate level, in a subject like history, you are doing enormous amounts of writing. And my professors kept telling me that, you know, I should go on and do doctoral work because I would undoubtedly be able to publish a book on the subject of my thesis. So they seemed to think I was, you know, sort of capable. And the actual way it happened was that I had a husband who kept on getting promoted, which was very nice from the point of view of our finances, but it wasn't so good from the point of view of actually trying to live a life. And I was awarded, we were in Australia at this point, and I was awarded a Commonwealth Fellowship to write my doctoral thesis. And I had literally just received the phone call telling me about that. And my husband came home that same evening and said we were being transferred back to the States, to Cleveland, Ohio. I can't say that I was jumping for joy, but the fellowship was for $10,000 a year, and I was pregnant with our fourth child. So we could have stayed in Australia and lived on $10,000 a year with 4 children, or we could go back to the States and live in Ohio, where my husband was going to be earning very significantly more than that. So it was never there was never a chance that I could stay there. And so I once again enrolled in college in Ohio. And then 2 years later, we were moved again. And when we got to Toronto, Canada, which is where we were moved for that move, I think rebellion struck. I just sort of thought, I am tired of taking history courses so that I will be approved for my thesis, because quite rationally, an American college doesn't want to give you a PhD in history when you admit that you have never in your life, ever, at any stage of your education, taken a single course in American history. So, I had to do that in the States, and then I get to Canada, and again, quite rationally, the Canadians decided that, yeah, they would love to have me, but first I was going to have to do introductory courses to Canadian history. And so I sort of went home and thought, I am tired of this. And I don't know how people make strange decisions that are very important, but I sat down at my electric typewriter and looked at it and thought, I am going to write a novel. I'm going to give up and I'd been spending years pursuing this academic career. And I literally in the course of an afternoon said, I'm going to write a novel, which was a great idea, except I had no clue what I wanted to write about. Anyway, so that's how I started writing.
And up to that point, where I assume you were still a voracious reader inside academics and outside academics.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
A celebration at the end of each semester was to buy a new Georgette Hare novel and read her latest Regents, what we would now call a Regency historical. That was my celebration.
Yeah, that's great. So that spark, that moment, you're in Toronto, I'm going to write a novel. What did you do? I read in your piece that you wrote that you spotted a documentary about some little publishing house that became a fairly big name in the world, but that steered you to submit a query to the publisher in England.
Yes. Canada in those days, this is no longer true, was oriented to the publishing world in England. Canadian authors tended to be published first by British publishers, and the subsidiary rights for Canada were quite separate from the subsidiary rights for the United States. So it was, anyway, yes. And I originally assumed that I would just write a novel. I've no idea what I quite thought that meant. But when I was in the process of deciding that writing the great American novel was a great deal harder than I thought it was going to be, I saw this television program that took viewers into an editorial meeting at Harlequin, Toronto. It was absolutely fascinating. They were reading out pages and deciding whether those pages conformed to the general feeling about morals that Harlequin, wanted to impose. And I mean, they had a strict rule that sex before marriage was impossible, could not be printed, because that would make them unacceptable in many of their outlets where they placed their books. And this was the first time I'd ever had any sort of contact with anybody who was publishing stuff other than academic treatises.
Mm-hmm.
And it caused me to realize that I could go to the library and just look inside the covers of the sort of books that I liked, and then I would discover who was publishing stories that I liked.
Yeah.
Because finding information was so difficult. I mean, it had never occurred to me, and perhaps in the general publishing industry, this didn't happen, but in the niche in which Harlequin was coming to operate, there were extremely strict guidelines about what could be done and what couldn't be done. But those guidelines weren't available anywhere. I mean, there was no internet where you could go on and look up what the guidelines were. But I had gathered from that editorial recording that they had very strong views on viewpoint, which of course, when when you read a lot and when you love to read, I don't think you think about the technical stuff. I don't believe I'd ever heard the word viewpoint until that editorial meeting. And I understood that what it basically amounted to was that you were writing only from one point of view, and it had to be the heroine's point of view, and you could express nothing that wasn't available to her through her viewpoint. So I sat down. I mean, for me, it was fairly easy to comply with rules and regulations. I'd been doing it when I'd been writing historical theses forever. So I sat down and wrote something, the infamous, "This has too much suspense." And I didn't know in those days that it was considered really bad form to submit your manuscripts to more than one person at a time, one publishing house at a time. And my husband was very supportive, and he had access to copying machines. So he made me 4 copies of my typewritten manuscript.
Which was, give us the title if you remember it. I assume you do.
I unfortunately do. I'm embarrassed by what it was. It was Forgotten Marriage. And I'm happy to report that I don't believe it's ever been republished in the States, which is a blessing. I have to be grateful for that.
Anyway, sorry, I interrupted your flow. You said you got 4 copies.
So I had 4 copies. And since I thought I'd written a romance, I tied it up in pink ribbon because that seemed appropriate, to hold the pages together, like a legal document gets tied up in red tape, mine was tied up in pink ribbon. And I sent it off to 4 publishers. But I actually was informed enough to realize that the editorial decisions were being made by Mills and Boon in England. They were not being made by this little editorial office in Toronto. So I sent it to Mills and Boon, who actually very quickly told me that they only published romances, and I had written something that wasn't a romance, apparently. And I submitted it to 3 other publishers. I don't remember whom, but one of them bought it. That very first manuscript, which seems like an amazing achievement, but they bought it for the princely sum of $200. They were not exactly expecting money. And they published it in hardcover. And in but in retrospect, I realized what it was. there was a vibrant library market in Britain. And in Britain, libraries may only stock hardcover edition. They cannot fortify paperbacks and place those on their shelves. So basically, the publisher was feeding a guaranteed market where, you know, one copy would go into the biggest libraries in the system, and that was it. But being a published author makes a huge difference, because if you're a published author, when you're trying to get an agent, you can say, I am published. And even though any agent would know that Robert Hale, the publisher I worked with, on the whole, was, you know, buying pretty crummy manuscripts, at least they know that you weren't totally incapable of finishing the book, or that you didn't write so that it was incomprehensible. And with my second book, I actually, no, not my second book, my third book, I decided to write an historical. And not only did I get an agent with that book, but oddly enough, Robert Hale sold it to Mills and Boon for the paperback rights. And at that time, there were only, I think, 2 authors in the whole of the United States who'd sold a manuscript to Harlequin. One was me, and the other was Janet Daly. I don't know if that name is familiar to you.
Not my
Not
world.
your cup of tea.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that was how I got started.
Wow. So, you know, there's a lot to cover, and we're in Toronto. You're starting to write fiction. You sold a few books in Toronto, and then ended up going to Illinois, where I understand you had your first exposure to the idea of a writer's workshop. Yes.
I'd done all this publishing without really knowing anything about publishing at all. And there was a local newspaper in those days, and it published events of interest at the local library. And one of those events of interest was a writer's workshop that was meeting regularly in the Barrington Library. I was really excited. I had never met another person. I mean, I'd met people who published academic stuff. I had never met somebody who wrote a novel of any sort.
Right. Wow.
So I went, they had weekly meetings, which was even better. And because it was a suburb of Chicago, which is really a big center for, or it certainly was then, a big center for writers. And they had this excellent system that I think it was once a month, a speaker, or every 4th meeting, a speaker would come. And that speaker would agree to critique, before he or she came, a certain number of manuscripts. Well, not all of them, but like the first chapter. And we had some really wonderful information. And then it was an established group, so they already had, on the other 3 meetings in the month, that was a critique group. That's what we did in the other 3 meetings. So I learned how you could do critiques. And there were children's book authors who were published. There was a poet who was published. There was somebody who'd written a really good nonfiction book that was published. So we had to be very adaptable in our critiquing. And I think I learned so much from that. I mean, it's extraordinary. And everybody, there was one writer who really still had a lot to learn. But one day he came and he had a character who needed to get from New York to Los Angeles. And transitions have always been my bugbear. And this guy had done the obvious. the character ends up, whatever was the important action in New York, and the next words in the manuscript were, leaving the airport in Los Angeles. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's how you do it. You don't have to explain that he gets on the plane and he gets in his seat. And so there's always something to learn, even from people who are not necessarily the best writers, you know?
Yeah.
Or not at that point, the best writers. So many people have stuff to contribute.
So when another one of your husband's, I gather, job transfers led you to Denver.
Yes.
And so you immediately said to yourself something along the lines of, can I find something to replicate that writer's workshop in
Absolutely.
the Denver area?
Yes.
And do you remember how long it took you to find what was then, I gather, the chapter of Romance Writers of America?
I think I must have been able to find it because I already knew about the Romance Writers of America, and I think I must have known that they had a Denver chapter. Mm-hmm. So that was how I acquired that knowledge.
Yeah.
Because, you know, the interesting thing about the publishing industry as a whole at that time was that in its own way, it was undergoing really amazing changes. I would say that up until at least the mid-70s, the publishing industry had no idea who bought their books or what market they were aiming for. And so you had editorial staff that were almost exclusively male. So the way books were chosen were, if I enjoy reading this book, then we'll publish it. And so, as you can imagine, books tended to be very male oriented. And given the epoch, they tended to be very white, middle class, male oriented. But then the publishing industry as a whole got together and actually conducted a survey. And they discovered to their astonishment that almost all fiction in bookstores was bought by women. I mean,
shocking.
Well, it was to them.
Yeah, I know.
You know, they just had no clue.
Yeah.
And Mills and Boon almost single-handedly launched a revolution because they were in England, it's true, but they had known for ages that women would go into the local 7-Eleven equivalent or the grocery store, and with their housekeeping money, they would buy paperbacks if they were next to the magazine racks, which didn't happen in the States, really. I mean, they weren't placed in those venues. So they were incredibly successful. And Canada followed the example and saw, if we did this in the States, we would make a fortune. And the whole of the publishing industry suddenly realized, to their amazement, that Harlequin was putting out 12 books a month, 6 romances, which were very demure, very modest. And the romance, you know, they were holding hands and kissing, but that was about all. And then Harlequin Presents, which were slightly more sexually explicit, not very much. So what astounded the publishing industry at that point was that the print run for these books was 250,000 per book.
Wow.
And they sold out. So they were selling 24 books with 250,000 print runs and getting virtually no returns.
Wow. Yeah.
And so the publishing industry decided, gosh, it would be a really good idea to get in on this. And so suddenly an entire marketplace opened up with literally all the major publishing houses suddenly developed a romance line. And so many, many women who 5 years before would have had no opportunity for publication, there was suddenly an entire genre which reflected their experiences and that they could write for. And so you get this huge burst of new authors and women finding a creative outlet that literally hadn't existed before. So
Yeah.
it was an exciting time. And Romance Writers of America formed, I'm not quite sure when, but I think maybe 1980, 1979, somewhere, and grew instantaneously, almost by word of mouth. So that the romance industry changed the nature of what information about publishing was available for everyone, because then the mystery writers sort of, started to grow and everything else. So it was an interesting time.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. Interesting. So do you recall when, or do you remember the sort of organizational push when the Romance Writers of America chapter in Denver kind of evolved into RMFW? Were you part of the discussions that made that sort of bureaucratic transition?
It was the other way around, I think. Somebody came from RWA or somebody came home from a conference. Oh, Pat Dalton. She had the She had the information from RWA on how to set up your local chapter. And that was already existing by the time I got there. When I had been in Illinois, there had been no particular desire to organize a conference. It hadn't seemed relevant to what we were doing. So I had no thoughts about conferences, but I was amazed at the energy and enthusiasm which some of the early members of Rocky Mountain Fiction Writers understood, that they could raise funds, they could bring an editor and actually get to speak to, with an actual editor. They could encourage authors who were multi-published, but from outside our group, to come in from somewhere fairly close so that the expenses weren't too great. And almost from the beginning, when I was there, we were talking about organizing a conference. And at the time, I was stunned by the ability of all these people, the courage. To me, to just sort of say you're going to rent this enormous or request this enormous meeting room and assume that people will come. But they did. From the beginning, it was a huge success.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see that. It would feel like a leap, like, wow, somebody's really hoping for the best here, that people come out. That's right.
Yes.
Yeah. Yep. Wow. So much has changed when you look back. When you think, just how things flow today on the internet with queries and emails, and that the pace back then was so different. I've actually been writing long enough that I remember going to the library and spending hours looking through Writers Market, sitting at a table, taking notes.
Yeah. Well, it is extraordinary. And of course, every profession has a certain inertial impulse. I can remember that I and all my writer friends, when Amazon started and made available multiple books that in those days, basically you could get them digitally, but you needed a Kindle reader, which was fairly expensive, but also they would ship them to you very quickly. And I can't quite remember when this was. I think it maybe would be around 2000. And every single one of my writer friends immediately saw that Amazon was a huge game changer, and that it was maybe good or maybe bad for authors, but things were not going to be the same. And I can remember chatting with the CEO of Harlequin right around the same time and saying how important and that one of the senior editors was there at the same time, how important I thought Amazon was, and, you know, how were they handling this? And they said, well, you know, even in paperbacks, they constitute only 3% of book sales now. It's going to be a long time before that changes. And I just knew, I mean, every writer could see that they were wrong. I don't know why it seemed to us so apparent that this was going to change things. But the publishing industry did not see that it was going to change things for a very long time.
Yeah. Boy, oh boy. Yeah. It's been incredible. Sea change in the last 10, 15, 20 years. Just amazing. And I assume you remember, I'm sure you do, the kind of the stigma, maybe that's too hard a word to use, but there was definitely a feeling that self-publishing 25, 30, 35 years ago, that was last resort. That was something you only did as sort of a vanity thing. And now independent publishing, self-publishing is just very, very commonplace.
Absolutely. Because people were self-publishing in the past, I think, either because I can imagine somebody writing a family biography that they want to publish in order to give to their friends and, you know, their grandchildren and so on. And from the moment they started writing it, they knew it would be self-published and there would be no reason for them to do anything else with it. But aside from that, I mean, the other name for self-publishing in those days was vanity publishing.
Yeah.
And it was vanity publishing because you self-published when every single reputable publisher had rejected your book.
Right, right.
Which is so not the case.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just absolutely not the case anymore.
Yeah. It is great. I personally believe it's wonderful today to have that opportunity for somebody with a story to tell or something they need to put out in the world, that they have the ability to go do that, and it's not seen as
absolutely.
Yeah.
The only thing that I find, I mean, it was one of the reasons that I stopped writing. I personally find the whole endless self-promotion and blogging and constantly updating websites and this sort of thing, I find that exhausting and detracting. And obviously, if you're John Grisham, you're paying somebody else to do all of that.
Yep.
You know, if you're not going to pay somebody else to do it, I think that's very hard. But then on the other hand, writers who've grown up in that tradition probably don't find it so hard. They just consider it part of the process. And so
it's water to a fish, basically.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
So you came to Rocky Mountain Fiction Writers, you were already fairly experienced published novelist when Rocky Mountain Fiction Writers really got off the ground. But what would you say RMFW has meant to you over the decades?
A lot. First of all, if you're just going about your daily life, you don't meet other writers. So if you're a writer, you're obsessive. I mean, every writer is obsessive. The work in progress is the most important thing in the universe. And anyway, you know, if you're working to a contract deadline, you probably are writing at least 5, maybe 6 days a week. So you're practically a hermit. You're not meeting other people. But it doesn't necessarily mean you wouldn't like to have some friends and some conversations. And so certainly RMFW fulfilled that function for me. But in addition, as a writer, you can always learn new stuff. And it is astonishing how much you can learn just by being in a well-managed critique group and seeing, even if it's only seeing, oh my goodness, I see exactly what the mistake is there. And when you spot it in somebody else's work, it's easier to spot it in your own.
Yeah. Well, boy. Very true. Yep.
Yeah. And also the conferences were fun. I mean, the conferences were fun, critique sessions were fun. And we truly, the group of writers sort of became friends. We would decide to do things such as, oh, let's all go to the conference that's, I don't know, in Colorado Springs or something, where some group there was doing it. And so we would all drive together. Or one of the things that I did with Kay Bergstrom and Lee Carr, we decided that we would write a trilogy together where each one of us wrote a book, and that in some they made a whole, you know. And it's really fun to do something like that occasionally.
Yeah.
You know, it's so much more fun to plot when you're not sitting there staring at the ceiling, but instead you're throwing out ideas to two other writers who are tossing new ideas back at you.
Yeah. And for me, when I joined Rocky Mountain Fiction Writers, the thing I was surprised to find is how much fun it is to root for your friends and how they go about their careers. And, you know, you can really celebrate their success, and their success has zero impact on your success or failure. It just, you feel like you're part of their achieving certain goals, whether it's getting an agent or getting that first contract or even just finishing a first novel.
Absolutely. Those are huge steps along the way. And you're absolutely right. It's fun to celebrate that. And we probably actually had celebrations that usually involved food that's bad for you. When somebody did things like getting an agent or first contracts, you know, we did all that stuff.
Yeah. Well, this has been really a great chat, Jasmine. I so appreciate your time. And kind of as we wrap up, I'm just sort of curious, maybe you have some authors or books you've read recently that you'd like to pass along, or, you know, maybe an all-time favorite writer that you think more people should be reading, something along those lines.
Yes, actually I do. I really like Sherry Thomas. She has written really clever, well-informed historical novels that are also fun to read. But sadly, or not so sadly, she, with great success actually, has started a series based on the Sherlock Holmes novels, but Sherlock is changed into Charlotte, who is Charlotte Holmes. But there are all sorts of reasons why nobody knows that she's actually a woman, because she's working in Edwardian England, and so she can't reveal it. And she's had 5 or maybe by now 6 extremely successful novels written in that vein. And since she's been so successful there, unfortunately, she stopped writing the rather more frivolous historical novels that I also loved. But I do think she's very talented. And
that's great.
She's Chinese by birth, and her command of the English language is intimidating.
Wow. Well, that's an excellent recommendation. I'm glad I asked. And again, Jasmine Cresswell, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for all you did, and you know, all your foundational early days, dawn of time support for Rocky Mountain Fiction Writers. Thank you so much.
It's been enjoyable talking to you. Thank you, Mark. Bye now.